We shall commence this module by discussing about public expenditure. Public expenditure refers to the expenditure which is incurred by the government of a country on central, state and local levels for the maintenance of the economy, external and internal security, and for the promotion of the socio-economic welfare of the people. These government expenditures also consist of expenditures done on the general, social and economic services. The principles of public expenditure are closely associated with the functions of the state and are interrelated with the aims as well as the ideals of the state which it attempts to achieve. The method of spending resources and the activities to be performed by the state are thus dependent upon the needs of the state, which are the given objectives for the public expenditure. The scope of public expenditure therefore enfolds within itself the money spending activities of the government. Throughout the 19th century, most governments followed laissez-faire economic policies and their functions were only restricted to defending aggression and maintaining law and order. Therefore, there was a minimal size of public expenditure. In the early 20th century, to determine the level of income and its distribution, the role of public expenditure was advocated by John Maynard Keynes. In developing countries, a public expenditure policy not only accelerates economic growth and promotes employment opportunities, but also plays a useful role in reducing poverty and inequalities in income distribution. Thus, the expenditures of the government all over have significantly increased. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the meaning of public expenditure, understand the classification of public expenditure, analyze the trends in development and non-development expenditures, analyze the trends in plan and non-plan expenditures, focus upon the lessons learnt from rising expenditures and why there is a need to prioritize. Let us now discuss the classification of public expenditure. Every year the government prepares an estimate of expenditures it is projected to incur or had incurred in the past and then puts it for a parliamentary approval in the form of budget document. This document classifies various expenses under different categories for better accounting, reporting and financial management purposes. The government expenditures are classified as: first, revenue and capital expenditures. Revenue expenditure is current or consumption expenditure. This recurring expenditure incurs year after year. Revenue expenditures comprise of interest payments, defense revenue expenditures, subsidies on food, fertilizers and export promotions and others, debt relief to farmers, postal deficits, police expenditures, pensions and expenditures on other general services like organs of state, tax collection, external affairs, etc. On the other hand, capital expenditure of the government refers to those expenditures which results in creation of fixed assets. Capital expenditures are incurred in building durable assets like expenditures on agricultural and industrial development, highways, dams and irrigation projects, purchasing machinery and equipment. They are non-recurring types of expenditures in the form of capital investments. Such expenditures are anticipated to improve the productive capacity of the economy. Capital expenditure include capital outlays and loans to the states and union territories to finance the planned projects, loans to public enterprises and loans to foreign governments. Capital defense expenditures are also included in this category. The second category is plan and non-plan expenditure. Under this classification, all public expenditures are classified into plan expenditures, which means that plan expenditure comprises of all the expenditures of the government which are included in the central plan. The expenditures related to new projects and programs become plan expenditures during a plan. Plan expenditures are further divided into revenue and capital expenditures. Non-plan expenditures. These are the expenditures which are committed on completed schemes of earlier plans and the interest on borrowings to finance capital. Non-plan expenditures are also further segregated into revenues and capital expenditures. Revenue expenditures occur in the day-to-day running of the government. Capital expenditure, on the other hand, are those expenditures that lead to a creation of either physical or financial asset or reduction in recurring financial liabilities. Third is development and non-development expenditures. There is yet another classification of government expenditures. The first one is the development expenditures, which includes all the items of expenditures which are designed to further social welfare and economic development directly. Development expenditures mainly include spending on economic services like agriculture, industry, communication, transport, energy, science, technology and environment, and social services including education, health, employment, nutrition, housing and others. The basic needs of the people in developing countries can be fulfilled through the expenditures by the government on social and economic services. However, the share of the centre's expenditure on social services is small. Given the division of responsibilities between the centre and the states, about 85% of the spending on social services in India is undertaken by the state governments. It is the responsibility of the states to spend on social services for human development. Further, states are responsible for most of the infrastructure services except telecommunications, railways, civil aviation and major ports and law and order. The other expenditure is non-development expenditure, which includes expenditures which relate to the general services rendered by the government such as preservation of law and order, defense of the country and the maintenance of the general organs of the government. Non-development capital expenditures comprise of capital defense expenditures, loans to the public enterprises, states and union territories and foreign governments, while non-development revenue expenditure comprise revenue defense expenditures, administrative expenditures, subsidies, debt relief to the farmers, postal deficit, pensions, grants to states and union territories and foreign governments. Next, we will be understanding the trends in the public expenditure in India. Government expenditures in India have been growing very rapidly after 1980-81. Moreover, the structure of the expenditure has also been changing. The economic crisis of 1991 led to the fiscal deficits and the only way to reduce them was reducing the expenditures. The revenues could not be increased much because of the rationalization of the tax structure. Post the crisis, the deficits were reduced by cutting down the planned expenditures along with the capital expenditures. The increase in government expenditures in the 80s and then a fall in 90s and beyond is evident from table. Total expenditures as a percentage of GDP was 15.21 in 1980-81 and increased to 17.96% in 1990-91. In the 90s, the rate fell down and was 15.01% in 2000-2001. In 2010-11, it was 15.60%. In absolute terms, the total public expenditure has increased by almost 50 times from rupees 22,768 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 11,97,328 crores in 2010-11. The absolute figures are in the current prices, therefore the actual growth is shown as a percentage of GDP. Moving on to discuss the trends in development and non-development expenditures. Levels of development expenditures followed a trend similar to that of the total public expenditure. The share of the development expenditures in the GDP rose after 1980-81 and reached its peak values in the mid-80s. In 1980-81, the share of the development expenditures in GDP was 8.91% and it increased to 10% in 1990-91. Thereafter, the share fell sharply in the 90s and was 6.43% in 2000-2001. In 2010 and 11, the share of the development expenditure in GDP increased to 8.68%. Thus, while there was a rise in the share of public expenditure and development expenditure in the GDP until the mid-80s, the trend had reversed significantly in the 90s and continued in 2000s. The rising share of the non-development expenditure is an important factor that has been constraining the growth of the development expenditures. Non-development expenditures continued to be a large proportion of the total expenditures. Defense, debt services and administrative expenses were so large and so significant that they were responsible for keeping non-development expenditure at a high level. The share of non-developmental expenditures in total expenditures of the centre grew from 42.54% in 1980-81 to 45.70% in 1990-91 and 58.62% in 2000 and 2001. Then in 2000s, the trend reversed and it fell to 45.29% in 2010 and 11. Development expenditures remained more than non-development expenditures as a percentage of total expenditures in the 80s. In 1980-81, it was 57.46% and remained at 54.30% in 1990-91. The government was focused on the improvement in the infrastructure, therefore the expenditures on development activities like rural electrification, irrigation and flood control and rural upliftment were high. Crop insurance schemes, social security schemes and anti-poverty programs were launched. Many employment generation schemes and other rural development like National Rural Employment Plan, Integrated Rural Development Plan, National Rural Employment Plan and Rural Landless Employment Guarantee Program were launched in 1987-88. Apart from these, expenditure on energy, transportation, railways, communication, health services and rural water supply, housing, etc. were increased. Non-development expenditure increased during this period owing to increased interest rates and defense expenditures. As a percentage of GDP, non-development expenditures increased from 6.59% in 1980-81 to 8.42% in 1990-91, which has been represented in table 2. Large portion of the borrowed funds was loaned to priority sectors, weaker sections of the society and the state governments for development at subsidized rates. External debts were increasing along with deterioration in the quality of the debt during the last half of the decade. This was the major cause of increase in non-developmental expenditures during that period. Thus, the composition of expenditures was more in favor of the development expenditures during the 80s. In the 90s, the development expenditures started declining. With the introduction of reforms, the composition of expenditures started changing towards non-development expenditures. Development expenditures as a percentage of total expenditures in 1990-91 was 54.30%. It came down to 41.38% in 2000 and 2001. On the other hand, the share of the non-development expenditures in total expenditures increased from 45.70% in 1990-91 to 58.62% in 2000 and 2001. As a percentage of GDP, the rate of development expenditure came down from 10% in 1990-91 to 6.43% in 2000 and 2001, and the share of the non-development expenditure during the same period increased from 8.42% to 9.11%. In 2000s, the development expenditures as a percentage of total expenditures started rising again after falling in the 90s. This was because of the slowdown of the reforms since 1996-97, the drought of 2002 and 2003, the growth objectives of FRBMA and the National Common Minimum Program in 2007 and 8. Development expenditures as a percentage of GDP rose from 6.43% in 2000-2001 to 8.68% in 2010 and 11. Non-development expenditure as a percentage of GDP continued to fall throughout. It was 9.11% in 2000-2001 and came down to 7.19% in 2010 and 11. As a share of total expenditures, development expenditures have risen from 41.38% in 2000-2001 to 54.71% in 2010 and 11. Non-development expenditures fell from 58.62% in 2000-2001 to 45.29% in 2010 and 11. Now, we will be moving on to the trends in plan and non-plan expenditures. Plan expenditures share in total expenditure declined in the 80s, 90s and the decade 2000-2010. It was 39.50% in 1980-81, which is declined to 26.94% in 1990-91, and in 2000 and 2001, it was 25.39%. In 2000s, the trend reversed. Through the share of plan expenditure improved to 31.66% in 2010-11, the plan expenditures has increased from rupees 8,994 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 3,79,039 crores in 2010 and 11, showing an absolute increase of about 45 times. Non-plan expenditures have been rising very fast in the recent years. In the 80s, the non-plan expenditures were about rupees 13,774 crores and it was rupees 8,1802 189 crores in 2010 and 11. As a percentage of total expenditures, the share of non-plan expenditures increased from 60.50% in 1980-81 to 74.61% in 2000-2001. Then it came down to 68.34% in 2010 and 11. Plan expenditures as a percentage of GDP decreased from 6.01% in 1980-81 to 4.84% in 1990-91. Non-plan expenditures went up from 9.20% to 13.12% during the same period. The reasons for high growth in non-plan expenditures during this period were drought faced by the major parts of the country during the year 1985-88, increasing interest payments, defence expenditure, subsidies and implementation of 4th Pay Commission recommendations. Thus, during the 80s, the non-plan expenditures were increasing at a greater pace as compared to the plan expenditures. In the 80s, the growth of the non-plan expenditures had been faster than the growth of the plan expenditure. This continued in the beginning of 90s, however, with the introduction of the reforms, this trend had reversed. As a percentage of GDP, the non-plan expenditure was 13.12% in 1990-91 and reduced to 11.20% in 2000 and 2001. A check on the fast growth of non-plan expenditure had been possible because of the number of steps taken by the government in 1991 reforms like the reduction of subsidies. As a proportion of total expenditures, the share of plan expenditures decreased from 26.94% in 1990-91 to 25.39% in 2000 and 2001. Non-plan expenditures increased from 73.06% to 74.61% in the same years. In the 2000s, the plan expenditures rose again and was 31.66% of the total expenditures in 2010 and 11. Non-plan expenditures went down to 68.34% in 2010-11. As a percentage of GDP, plan expenditures were 4.94% and non-plan expenditures were 10.66% in 2010 and 11. Let us now discuss the lessons and priorities. An analysis of the central government expenditures shows that while the development expenditures in absolute terms had been higher than the non-development expenditures, the latter had been rising faster throughout the 80s and 90s. Development expenditures had outweighed non-development expenditure in absolute terms in the 2000s. Accordingly, the increase in non-plan expenditures has been more than the plan expenditures for the 3 decades. The increase in the total expenditure of the central government can be mainly attributed to an increase in revenue expenditures at the cost of the capital expenditures. Wages and salaries, interest payments and subsidies accounted for a predominant share of the government expenditure. The sharp increase in expenditures in the 80s as compared to the modest increase in tax and non-tax revenues resulted in high deficits by the end of the decade. The immediate response to the economic crisis in 1991 was to compress expenditures, mainly focusing on reducing subsidies. There was a shift away from plan expenditures accompanied by a reduction in capital expenditures. The deficits were reduced by cutting down the development and capital expenditures. Within revenue expenditures in 1980-81, defence expenditures had the highest share of 22.75%. Interest component was 18.07%, while subsidies were 14.07%. However, by 1990-91, the largest component was the interest share of 29.24%, with subsidies constituting 16.54% and defence only 14.79%. Because of the reforms, there was some reduction in the centre's fiscal deficit up to 1996-97. The trend was reversed afterwards under the impact of the industrial slowdown and the implementation of the recommendations of the 5th Pay Commission's award. Once again, fiscal consolidation was brought about through compression of capital expenditures with consequential effects on growth and infrastructure constraints in the future. Since the fiscal correction was achieved through cutbacks in capital expenditures rather than through improved revenues, the consolidation efforts could never be sustained for long. The government had limited scope to reduce the defence budget due to security problems across the Indian borders. The interest payments both on domestic and foreign loans have been one of the major components of the government expenditure and have been increasing throughout as the government debt has increased considerably over the years. Another cause of concern is subsidies. The government has been providing subsidies on a number of items such as fertilizers, exports, food and fuel, and these subsidies have been increasing over the years, resulting in the fiscal imbalance. Therefore, the development and capital expenditure have suffered the most when it comes to reducing the expenditures. Priorities. Despite rapid economic growth and buoyant revenues, India's inability to contain expenditures growth has led to a modest decline in the general government debt. The government needs to focus on reducing the revenue expenditures and increasing the growth rate of the capital expenditure. Great detail is required for better targeting of the social expenditures to achieve fiscal consolidation while maintaining the process of growth. Expenditures need to be reoriented to contain the deficits whilst providing adequate outlays for essential social sector like education, health, etc. The government needs to strengthen the public distribution system for better targeting of subsidies, bring in efficiencies and make the system more transparent. Overstaffing in government departments has led to low productivity and inefficiencies, hence downsizing of staff is essential. This shall also reduce the wage bill of the government substantially. The borrowings from the internal and external sources should be closely monitored in order to control the interest payments. Let us now summarize what we have discussed in this module. Public expenditure refers to the government expenditure which was incurred by the center, state and local government of a country for the maintenance of the country, external and internal security and for the promotion of the socio-economic welfare of the people. The government expenditure were 15.21% of GDP in 1980-81 and increased to 17.96% in 1990-91 and then again it fell down to 15.01% in 2000-2001. However, in 2010 and 11 it was 15.60% of the GDP. In absolute terms, the total public expenditure had increased by almost 50 times from rupees 22,768 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 11,97,328 crores in 2010 and 11. In 1980-81, the share of development expenditure in GDP was 8.91% and it increased to 10% in 1990-91. Thereafter, the share fell sharply in the 90s and was 6.43% in 2000-2001. In 2010-11, the share of development expenditures in GDP increased to 8.68%. As a percentage of GDP, non-development expenditures increased from 6.59% in 1980-81 to 8.42% in 1990-91 and then to 9.11% in 2000-2001 and then it fell down to 7.19% in 2010 and 11. The development expenditures in absolute term have always been higher than the non-development component. The plan expenditures had increased from rupees 8,994 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 3,79,039 crores in 2010 and 11, showing an absolute increase of about 45 times. In the 80s, the non-plan expenditures were about rupees 13,774 crores and it was rupees 8,18,289 crores in 2010 and 11. Plan expenditures as a percentage of GDP decreased from 6.01% in 1980-81 to 4.84% in 1990-91 and 3.81% in 2000 and 2001. However, the trend reversed and in 2010-11 the ratio was 4.94%. As a percentage of GDP, the non-plan expenditure were 9.20% in 1980-81, 13.12% in 1990-91, which was reduced to 11.20% in 2000-2001 and further to 10.66% in 2010 and 11. The fiscal correction was achieved through cutbacks in capital expenditures rather than through improved revenues. Therefore, the consolidation efforts to reduce deficits could never be sustained for long. The government needs to focus on reducing the revenue expenditures, especially subsidies and interest payments, along with better targeting of social expenditures to achieve fiscal consolidation while maintaining the process of growth.